Welcome to Energy Innovations, a regular video series that explores the latest innovations in technology, digital, regulations, products, services, finance, and business models that are impacting the energy sector. Energy Innovations interviews entrepreneurs, energy companies, capital markets, and regulators to understand how the energy industry is changing.
Welcome back to Energy Innovations, and on today's discussion, we're going to dig into this challenge of the resources we need for the future, because as we shift our demands away for the electrification of transportation, we'll be moving away from fossil fuels, at least partially, although we'll continue to need fossil fuels for things like plastics, among other things. But there is a new demand on the horizon, which is the need for different kinds of minerals, metals, and ores, which are required for electrification of transportation. And to walk our way through this, I'm joined by Jack Mintz, who is the President's Fellow of the School of Public Policy with the University of Calgary, and calling in from Toronto this morning. Jack, welcome to Energy Innovations.
Oh, thank you very much. My pleasure, Geoffrey.
Now, let's begin with what has been some of the drivers behind this interest in the shift towards new minerals, metals, and ores. What's driving this broader conversation now in Canadian industry?
Well, I think it's not just in Canada, but it's around the world. I think in going to net zero by 2050 in terms of emissions, if we get to that, of course, we are going to be looking at significant amounts of electrification, and that electrification is going to need certain types of metals, particularly, that have not been as much in demand as they will be in 30 years' time due to battery production and construction of automobiles, et cetera, that is going to go hand in hand, plus some of the other materials that are going to go into infrastructure to build new pipelines or transmission lines or whatever. And so, as some people have talked about, we're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars. Even McKinsey has $275 trillion of new investment over the next 30 years, which is like 5% of GDP, world GDP. I think that's going to be a tremendous change that we're going to be undertaking as we move in that direction. And metals and mining is now going to be a major focus for countries as a result.
The challenge, of course, here is the redirection of capital away from traditional investments and into new and expanding sectors. To what degree is the finance world, the public policy world, the governments, to what degree are we adequately focused on this question at this stage?
Well, I think I think maybe there's maybe a bit too much focus, in the sense that people think that these new technologies are just sitting out there that can be used to replace fossil fuels in a very short period of time. And I'm talking about 10 years or 12 years if we go to 2035, and that is not even feasible. I mean, in my experience, working with companies over the years and observing how long it takes for new technologies to be adopted and commercialized, not just simply found to be engineeringly feasible, but also financially feasible, that it takes a much longer time than even 12 years for major redevelopments. Plus, you also have to change people's minds about how they do things. And so, I think the biggest problem right now is that everyone can talk about what we would like in 30 years from now, but we don't know how to get there in 30 years and how fast that we can do the development.
And so I think where people get confused, perhaps, is the rapid pace by which we see change taking place in our more consumer-oriented world, and extrapolating that to a more an industrial setting leads people down the pathway to think this is going to happen a lot faster than it really will. Whereas it's likely much more slowly. How do other things like energy security now crowd into this agenda to make this a particularly thorny problem to solve?
Well, I think the geopolitics is really kind of fascinating, and I think it's something that we should be very focused on, which of course includes security. When you sort of look at it right now, China is not holding back on use of coal as a source of energy. And in fact, its emissions have been growing. And in fact, they make it very clear they're not going to be reducing them until after 2030. And we'll see what happens after that point as well. And we also know that many of the other developing countries, particularly large ones like India, are not looking at reducing fossil fuel consumption for some time. But in the meantime, the Western countries are engaging in a transition that at this time is not being very well planned and could end up being very expensive and a very high cost effort with high energy prices, which could actually impact the competitiveness and the economic strength of our own economies. So we have that geopolitical issue to deal with. And of course, we're seeing this big time now with the Ukrainian-Russian war and the problems that Europe has in terms of energy security by moving too quickly along the path of thinking that renewables can replace fossil fuel energy quickly enough. And now they're caught with potential major energy shortages if Russia particularly cuts back its natural gas supply for this winter. In fact, we're going to find out very soon what's going to happen with that respect. At the same time, China is playing a brilliant game of investing in Africa, Latin America, Asia, where the minerals lie that are going to be needed for the energy transition. And so as the West, if it's weakened economically, comes out to finally get to the energy transition in which we are primarily using batteries and renewables, by 2050, we may find that most of those minerals are going to be sitting in new Middle East. Let me put it that way, like Latin America, Africa, and Asia, with heavy involvement by China, which is investing quite heavily right now in these countries. And so the Chinese, I think, are playing a brilliant geopolitical strategy and geoeconomic strategy, which could put the West at a disadvantage in 30 years' time. Never mind what's going to happen over the period when we get to 2050.
Yeah, I think the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is the expansion of industrial infrastructure, road and rail transportation, port facilities, is a critical long game play because it takes a very long time to put it into place and cements long-term relationships with these countries. What kind of minerals, metals, and ores are we actually talking about here? And what is Canada's positioning relative to the availability of these resources?
Well, actually, it's interesting you asked that question because last week, Phil Bizal at the School of Public Policy, who's been working with me, has now put together some new data on both reserves and production of major producers around the world for those metals or minerals that are going to be required for the energy transition. And if you don't mind, I'll get a little piece of paper in front of me because just to give you an idea exactly what's involved. People forget people often talk about lithium because lithium is right now the most favored metal to be used for battery electrification. The biggest producer in the world today, of course, is Australia, which accounts for a very significant share of production in the world. However, the largest reserves are found in what's called the lithium triangle of Bolivia, which is not producing any lithium right now, or very little, Chile, and Argentina. In fact, they account for 70% of the world reserves in lithium. And in an article I wrote in the Financial Post last summer, I talked about Latin America being the new Middle East, and of course, talking about Chinese investments that have been quite heavy in this area in recent years is a very good example of what I mean by the geopolitical aspects of the fact that lithium, or let me put it this way, Latin America, particularly the lithium triangle, could be the new Middle East in the future as they account for a very important metal that's involved. Another important one that we often forget about because you need it for automobiles and various other matters. By the way, Canada's a very small lithium producer. We could be producing more, but right now we're not even in the top 6 or 7 countries that produce lithium. Another important metal, of course, is copper, which you mentioned earlier on. Chile is the biggest copper producer in the world, about almost 30% of all world production. And this is followed by Peru at 10% and China at 8%. Canada doesn't even show up in the top 5 or 6 countries producing copper. And if you ask where are the reserves, well, again, significant reserves are in Chile and Latin America in general. Although Australia has quite large copper reserves as well. In fact, Australia is a major mining producer, and of course will be the West's important ally in that respect. Cobalt is another important product that's needed for electrification, and as we know, the Congo is responsible for roughly 69% of production of cobalt today. And they also have about half of the world reserves in cobalt. This is followed by Russia and Australia, Australia has almost 20% of the world's reserves in cobalt, so it will be an important ally. And Canada actually does show up in the top 6 in this respect in terms of production, but we only have 3% of the world reserves when it comes to cobalt. And actually, the only I would say important metal in which Canada has that is significant is nickel in terms of the future resource. But again, there's other countries that outdo us quite a bit. Indonesia has 31% of world production today in nickel. And 22% of the world reserves. Philippines has 13% of today's world production, and about 5% of the world reserves. Russia has 11% of nickel production. Canada has close to 7%. We are in the top 6, tied with Australia, by the way. In terms of production, although our reserves are only 2% of the world reserves, so we won't play as much of a factor in the future. So when you actually start going through the metals one by one, you see that Canada is a producer when it comes to mining, and we do have mining resources, but we're not a big producer. And it may be possible that more reserves could be found. These are proven reserves that I'm talking about, which are the ones that are economic, are feasible to dig up and as ore and to use right away. But there's also other reserves which are contingent reserves or potential reserves that may be available if they become economic. And of course, there may be more reserves than we think that are out there, as well as the technology could change. Battery technology could change. All of a sudden, lithium is less important compared to other types of metals that might be used. So the world really is not known over the next 30 years. But I will say that if Canada wants to play a bigger role in mining, it's going to need to have the regulatory environment particularly, and to get to that stage. And we can talk a little bit more about regulatory and tax system around the world when it comes to mining.
And what are the long-run implications for, as governments are working their way through these challenges, what are the long-run implications for countries which are today highly dependent on the fossil fuel sector as we kind of run to a newer world? I mean, at a minimum, I would imagine it's a threat to national treasuries, which creates potential for social unrest. When countries may find themselves with too much of a product they can't sell. What are the sorts of things that governments and policymakers need to be thinking about in this realm?
Well, I think part of the difficulty in terms of talking about energy transition is we really don't know what's going to be types of energy sources that we are going to need in 2050. Obviously, there'll be wind and solar power that will be useful, but we also know it cannot be the only source of energy to produce because it's intermittent, it's not reliable. Plus, you're going to blanket the world with solar panels. It's very land intensive in that case, and so it just simply cannot work as we think that it could work. That means that we are going to need other sources. People are talking about nuclear energy as one source, and if you notice, some countries like China and France and others are looking at producing more nuclear energy. And in Canada, we're even talking about small nuclear reactors as a potential source of energy. So I think nuclear is something. It's clean, and it's from the point of view of emissions, GHG emissions, although it does produce nuclear waste, which is something that has to be handled for hundreds of years when it's buried in the ground. There's in the case of hydrogen, there's both green hydrogen that comes from let's say biofuels or well, not so much biofuels, but taking water and breaking it up. And then there's blue hydrogen that comes from natural gas, and potentially oil. So we don't know if fossil fuels will go out completely. As you mentioned earlier on, we do need fossil fuels for plastics, and plastics are expected to, by 2050, to make up about 20% of world demand, which by that time, and also we're still going to need tar and asphalt and some of the other things that fossil fuels are used for, as well as heating, probably to some extent. But again, it also may become the major source of hydrogen, which will end up replacing fossil fuels with another type of fossil fuel sourced energy. And so that can actually lead to more demand for fossil fuels than we think. Now, what does this mean to countries? Of course, I expect that certainly the oil producers are expecting that demand is going to get softer over the years with fossil fuel, although that may take some time, much longer than people think. But as a result, they will lose both the economic activity and the revenues that come along with that. Which has been important to their country. And of course, in Canada, that has significant regional impacts, particularly impacting Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, which are major producers of oil and gas for the international market. But again, if that leads to the substitution of other sources of energy, clean energy, then where's the uranium? Well, it's sitting in Saskatchewan. Whereas natural gas, it's sitting in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So there's no reason to think that actually those economies will go into will change completely. In fact, they could become clean energy superpowers in a sense if they make the right moves.
Yeah, it gets down to questions of making the right moves and the role of public policy in framing companies' playgrounds for making those moves becomes quite critical. So let's turn to this question of how competitive Canada's regulatory, government, social structures are to embrace change. And let's begin with things like taxation. How competitive is Canada today from a taxation standpoint if someone wanted to, say, invest in a lithium extraction program or exploration program, given that lithium is going to be one of these critical resources down the road?
Well, in the work that we do, and in fact, we've been recently doing it for the Inter-American Development Bank on Latin American and Caribbean countries, but in comparison to other major mining countries, as well as for Australia, we've been doing similar work. What we find actually is when it comes to taxation, leaving aside the carbon tax, that just looking at corporate income taxes, sales taxes on capital purchases, as well as other asset-based type taxes like capital taxes that you find in some countries, that actually Canada is really competitive when it comes to the tax system. We we actually incur. In fact, when it comes to mining, actually, they have the lowest effective tax rates in new investment compared to just about any country in the world. And that's because of the structure of our mining taxes, which tend to be based on income and not on the revenues or the value of production. And that the latter tend to have a very significant impact on marginal investments that earn just enough money to be feasible, but don't but end up getting particularly discouraged by royalties that you often find in many countries. And so in that sense, we're in good position. However, the carbon tax is another matter, because if we move to, let's say, $170 a ton, that could actually be a significant disadvantage relative to many major producers around the world, because there's very few major producing economies that are contemplating very high carbon prices and taxes as we are in Canada. And so that could become a negative for mining. We're not finished evaluating that issue. I have seen some work done that suggests that the carbon tax will play a very significant role in reducing the competitiveness of new lithium production, let's say in British Columbia. But I think for me, we still have to do some more work on that to make sure that we know for sure what the results might be. But that's about the only area that I think we're going to have to pay attention to, because that's a difficulty right now with clean public policies. We're moving ahead on carbon pricing and taxes, and clean fuel standards, and all sorts of other types of policies that are going much faster and deeper than most other countries around the world, especially when you have resource producing economies. So it's an issue that we have to think carefully about.
One of the cautionary tales, though, about the Canadian sector is Teck Resources, which took almost a decade from idea inception through the regulatory process to get full approvals, only to cancel the project at the end as conditions change. So we have a regulatory process in Canada which appears to be cautious, exhaustive, very thorough, open to lots of challenge. How competitive is our regulatory process in helping Canadian mining projects move their way through so that they can get to production?
Well, I think that's a bigger concern that I have with respect to our competitiveness for mining investments is our regulatory process. It's the Teck Resources case was one of oil sand mining, but even in the mining area that it's well known in Canada, and it's based on a number of studies that have been done, such as by the World Bank and others, that we are very slow at permitting. It takes a long time to get approvals for projects, and at the same time, when it comes to our infrastructure, we certainly can do a lot better than we can now. I mean, if we wanted to be major hydrogen producers, a whole new infrastructure has to be built, but the current pipeline infrastructure only goes down to the United States. And if we wanted to be players internationally, we would have to build up on that. As we found with LNG, for example, we're way behind the ball when it comes to LNG. When it comes to mining, though, they have to go through BLC, the structure that we've created, which I think you were very charitable in the way you described it in your question. I would say that the system is broke. It's got significant issues associated with it, where it requires it creates a lot of uncertainty. It goes through two phases, which in itself could be a sensible approach, as they've done in Australia, and because what they do in Australia, they approve corridors, and then let's say for trains or pipelines or highways or whatever, and then each project, if it goes into the corridor, will get its own evaluation, but it goes very quickly. And in fact, as I've heard Canadian major CEOs talk about it, when they're doing an investment in Australia versus Canada, they can get approval within a year to build a train or or to build an electrical transmission line, while in Canada it'll take ages to do that. And so we need to really get our game going and to improve what we're doing in terms of finally getting to a point where we can encourage investments and having a regulatory system that's much smoother than the one we have now. In my view, it's a failing regulatory system.
And I've had the privilege of working on the tech project, albeit briefly, years ago. And I've lived in Australia for 4 years working on the LNG projects. And there's no question that the Australian model has a tremendous applicability in a world that is resource constrained. Part of that is the resources are located in the interior of the country, typically where it's very sparsely populated. Blanket agreements are in place with Indigenous peoples to deal with the process of resource exploration and extraction. So there's advantages on there, but there's no question they move much faster. There's also a higher. Sorry, go ahead.
Just want to interrupt on one quick thing. I forgot to mention about the Indigenous issues. That's one where Australians move in some ways faster, in some ways slower than us. But we still have a lot of treaty issues to deal with, particularly in British Columbia. And so that is an unsettling issue, and it needs to be done. I think the good thing, though, is that many Indigenous groups or nations do have a great deal of interest in developing projects and having a share of that. And so I think if we could work out, let's say, better relations in terms of regulation and the development of these resources, which could be of tremendous assistance to First Nations across Canada, then I think we can move ahead. But that I think should be a number one priority as part of the whole regulatory changes that are going to be needed.
One of the other tripwires here is the way Canada is structured constitutionally. The resources are provincial jurisdiction until you get to you want to export, and then of course, it's an international question, cross-border question. So moving a pipeline, say, that moves fossil fuels across Quebec to Atlantic Canada is a fraught endeavor because you have to obtain social acceptance of this as a matter of provincial politics. How well situated is Canada to address some of these quite fast-moving issues? I mean, to get liquefied natural gas to Europe to solve for Europe's energy security crisis with Russia does mean moving very quickly to put into place infrastructure. And socially, we still have some issues here. How well positioned are we to be able to move beyond these and to get into this newer world that we seem to be fronting?
I don't think we're positioned very well. In fact, I think right now we have significant differences between the provinces and the federal government with respect to development of resources and who's responsible for what. I think that's certainly a major issue that's facing us right now. We have, in fact, a challenge to Bill C-69 now running to the Supreme Court after the Alberta court said that the bill is interfering too much with Alberta's responsibility to develop its resources, and that environmental policy can't be used by the federal government and international policy can't be used by the federal government to completely abrogate the responsibilities of Alberta. And all provinces, 9 provinces, have joined Alberta in that challenge to the Supreme Court. So we'll see what happens. But Quebec actually has the same view as Alberta on these issues as well as others. So that's one dimension that is still right there, and that could take several years to wind through. The other issue, of course, is when it comes to cross-border or any major projects, there's often quite significant opposition by people who are affected by projects that are near them. For example, wind power projects have been opposed. We even see even on the North American side, for Quebec trying to build a line going down into the northeast part of the United States is being opposed by Maine voters, et cetera. But that's an issue that I think is still front and center. And wait till we get to carbon capture and storage in Alberta, for example. Any leak of carbon dioxide could be horrible in terms of its impact on people and neighboring areas. So it's an issue that I think may be a significant concern to many people in terms of bearing carbon dioxide into the ground for forever. And so so these issues I think are going to be front and center. But I also think that if we are going to get anywhere, mining developments also are going to get challenged because of the slag that they can produce and things that can happen in terms of water, and so we're going to need a regulatory system that I think makes sure that we can do the development that is going to be safe, but at the same time doesn't completely stifle investment. And of course, this is something we've lived with for many years, and some countries do it better than others. For example, remember Brazil had a terrible mining slag leak that destroyed many homes, led to death. But we haven't had that kind of regulation in Canada. We generally have had pretty good regulation, but it doesn't mean that we move away from that. So we have to sort of make sure that we have a system that we have confidence in. And again, going back, to Australia, they've done a pretty good job themselves, and so I think we need to emulate some of the things that have been done in Australia that have succeeded. I think in making sure we have a regulatory system that's helpful and supports new investment. And to be frank, if you look at Bill C-69, there's some requirements now in terms of information that companies have to put together that is really strange. I mean, for example, gender issues. I mean, I think gender issues are important in public policy in various ways, but not everything has to be looked through in the lens of gender issues, and whether some project satisfies some sort of conditionality, which frankly people don't even know how to measure properly. Anyway, so those are the kinds of things I think are problematic in our system today.
Well, let's end this conversation though on a if we can on a positive note, which is what is the upside and the prize here for Canada if we can successfully address the challenges we have in front of us and leverage the structures that we have already in place. But what's the upside?
Oh, I think the upside is that we could be an energy superpower. And I mean in all sources of energy that's going to be required. We have the expertise. We have a tremendous number of wonderful scientists and other experts that are working in the fields. People don't realize that probably a lot of the clean energy expertise and investment will actually come out of the industries that right now are involved in energy. That tends to be what happens. And so we can be a real superpower, whether it's the clean energy of the future or the transformed oil and gas sector of the future and coal sector of the future that is going to be needed for whatever purposes to develop. And that's the thing. We don't know what the technologies are going to be in later years. We really have no idea. And I keep coming across people I talk to constantly, and they're working on some really fascinating things. Even with carbon, you can the money, carbon that's being stored, it could end up being a material used for society in later years. We'll have to see. But the thing is that there's lots of good ideas out there. People are working on them, and one good thing we have in Canada is a very well-educated workforce, as well as a lot of strength in the resource sector today that could be critical, I think, to developing the clean energy future that I think many people would like to see around the world by the end of this century.
and could be centered right here in Canada. Jack, thank you very much for coming on Energy Innovations today to talk about the resources of the future.
My pleasure. Thank you.
This has been another episode of Energy Innovations. If you like what you've heard, by all means, press that like button and share this episode with your friends. I'll be returning in a week's time with another episode. Bye for now.
Thanks for joining our latest interview on Energy Innovations from Energy Now Media. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video. You can contact us at info@energynow.com to book your appearance or to become a sponsor.